Hello, Sacke here back with another Genshin Impact video. Today, we'll be diving into the Genshin Impact damage formula and trying to answer if there is such a thing as the optimal damage, and if it does, then how do we calculate it? This video was inspired by a comment from Neom in a community post. Neom's comment implies that I should try to find a way to optimize damage in a more general sense rather than being account specific. The first thing I would like to point out is what it means to be optimal versus optimizing. Optimizing simply refers to a process of improving or making more efficient. In the case of this video, we're interested in damage optimization. Optimal refers to the most efficient point or the maximum possible damage. I think it's easy to say that proving that a maximum damage exists is much easier. The reason is simply because there is a maximum value all stats can have. Weapons, artifacts, and talents have maximum levels, and artifact substats can only be upgraded so many times. The hard question is if we can determine what build with optimal damage should look like. In Genshin Impact, there are various ways to increase our stats. Leveling up the character, leveling up the talent levels, unlocking constellations, equipping weapons, equipping artifacts, applying buffs to characters through skills, eating food, and using gadgets. Based on these methods, I believe that there are three types of stats: permanent, adjustable, and temporary. Permanent refers to stats where changing them is irreversible. Temporary is for stats that are changed only for a short period of time. And lastly, adjustable consists of stats that can be added or removed via the menus or equipment. When we talk about stat optimization, the set of stats that we want to improve are the permanent and adjustable stats. Though permanent stats don't really need much discussion as they upgrade specific predetermined stats. So for this video, we'll assume that the permanent stats are at their maximum point. So, a character level 90, normal charge attack at level 10, elemental skill and burst at level 13 and C6. The interesting part is when adjustable stats come into play. Things start to become more flexible because there are a lot of options now for how to build up your stats. In terms of weapons, they're also pretty straightforward for the most part. It's more about picking the right one than just leveling it up. The main issue with trying to optimize damage without being account specific is artifact RNG. Due to the massive amount of RNG that the artifact system poses, this means that there would have to be a huge amount of circumstances that needs to be accounted for. Now what I said makes it sound like it's impossible to find the optimal build, right? Well, it actually might not be too crazy of an idea, but it may also not be what you think. Stats are dependent on artifacts, and these stats thereby affect your overall damage. Trying to find the optimal damage in general is probably not feasible. However, considering a specific character is certainly much more achievable. Focusing on a single character makes things the easiest as you can already pinpoint the exact stats that the character scales off of. Because my main is Ningguang, and I understand her kit the most out of all characters, she will serve as my guide. Let's take a step back before we talk about stat allocation, the damage formula. There are a lot of terms here, but I would like to rename some of these variables, then segregate some of these multiplied terms into their own new variable. This allows you to not get too caught up in the length of the equation, but rather understand what each term is. These M's really just mean multiplier and are exactly what they're called. A multiplier is just a term that multiplies with the total base damage. Now, with all of that said, we now need a way to figure out how to balance each stat. There are many of them. A clue I mentioned earlier is that we already know what each character scales off of. For a character like Ningguang, the stat allocation is very simple, but for others it might be more complex. Ningguang is an attack scaling Geo character. Because of Geo's lack of an offensive elemental reaction, any terms related to reactions are automatically cancelled out. We can also just remove proc since it's not really applicable to us. For MRes, this depends on the type of enemy you're attacking, but for this case, we can assume it to be a constant. The same can be said for M defense. It's just dependent on enemy levels and we won't consider any defense reduction or ignoring, so it's constant. damage base total, M damage, and crit is where things get interesting. In terms of artifact optimization by only considering damage, we can actually use a very simple term, average crit. I know I made a whole video about it where I criticized its ability to predict the actual damage you deal, but since we're not looking too deeply into things, we can use it as a good enough approximation. Plus, it makes calculations simpler. So, yeah. For M damage, this would be dependent on geo damage bonus percent, so that's important, and we don't have any damage reduction. Lastly, for the total base damage, again because our character is Ningguang, the only important term is damage base. All the other terms just cancel out. Then for damage base, it's dependent on talent scaling and attack. After simplifying everything, we get this equation. It's quite long, but don't worry too much about it. In general, we can consider that our damage for Ningguang is really only dependent on a few stats: attack, geo damage bonus, crit rate, and crit damage. From here on out, the equations might get long, so I'm going to rename our variables. Alpha will be equal to talent percent, M-res, and M defense multiplied with each other. AB will be equal to attack base, A% will be equal to attack percent, AF equals attack flat, DB equals damage bonus, CR equals crit rate, and CD equals crit damage. Alpha is just to group up all the constants so we can focus on the variables. Unfortunately, we can't really do this for AB, which is also a constant but cannot be factored as nicely. We now need some sort of metric to gauge how good a specific set of stats is. Theory crafters might point toward substat rolls, however this metric is only useful within the scope of a single artifact. It doesn't provide much insight as to how it affects the entire character's output as a whole, and can't really tell you which stat needs to be invested in. In order to do that, I would like to bring in calculus, specifically partial derivatives and differentials. In short, a differential is a measure of how much a quantity changes. When you walk a certain distance, you can measure how far you've walked. What you're doing is measuring how far you've walked from where you were originally standing. You compared some initial value to a final value. Derivatives represent a change in a quantity with respect to the change in another thing. Going back to the walking example, if you consider how far you've walked with respect to time, what you're doing now is measuring how much your distance changes when you change time. Well, maybe you're not changing time, but time is changing. Let's say at the start of your walk, you walked very fast, but then about halfway to your destination, you slowed down. Think about this. At the part where you were walking fast, you were traveling a farther distance in a short amount of time. This tells us that the change in distance over a change in time was large. Therefore, the derivative of distance traveled with respect to time is also large. However, when you move at a slower speed, you can now see that the amount of time that it takes to travel the same distance is longer compared to when you were at a faster speed. So, a short distance and a larger amount of time means that the derivative in the distance with respect to time is smaller for this part. I've glossed over a bit of technicalities. Differentials and derivatives aren't just any change. Specifically, they work with very infinitesimally small changes at their core. The thing is, if I go into more detail, I'll end up spitting jargon that might not make much sense, so I won't really go over it. There are two types of derivatives, ordinary and partial. Ordinary derivatives are usually applied to functions that have only one variable, but you can apply it to multivariable functions where it becomes a total derivative. Our damage equation is a multivariable function specifically of attack, geo damage bonus, crit rate, and crit damage. A partial derivative is a quantity which describes the rate of change specifically to only one variable. We can measure how much a change in stats affects your overall damage by taking the total differential. For the difference between differential and derivative, a differential just looks at the change in a value. When you consider the change with respect to something specific, that's when it becomes a derivative. In short, a derivative is more like a relationship between two variables. How does one affect the change of another? In general, when we find the total differential of damage, we get the following equation. Let's break this down a bit. Here is the first term, the partial derivative of d with respect to a% times dA%. What does this mean? Remember that we've replaced our attack percent stat with a%. dA% is simple. It is a small change in the attack percent stat. The partial derivative of d with respect to a% is like a factor which shows how much a change in attack percent affects damage. So overall, these 5 differentials represent changes in our 5 stats: attack percent, attack flat, geo damage bonus, crit rate, and crit damage respectively. Next, the partial derivatives show how much a change in their respective stat affects the change in damage. I'll now calculate the partial derivatives. I won't be explaining how to do that because I think that won't make this video way too long, and I think that's better off in its own. And even then, there are plenty of places where you can Google to calculate them. One thing that people might notice is that the partial derivative of damage with respect to attack flat is much smaller than the other partial derivatives. Reason why this is the case is because attack percent, geo damage bonus, crit rate, and crit damage are percentage values, whereas attack flat isn't. In short, changes in attack percent, geo damage bonus, crit rate, and crit damage, by proxy of being percentage, change very little with changes in of artifacts compared to attack flat, which changes by about tens. The difference in magnitude could be that attack flat is approximately 100 or even 1,000 times larger than the other stats, so its partial derivative being smaller is more fair. The constant alpha is actually unnecessary to calculate because all it does is scale all of the partial derivatives by the same amount. So therefore, these are the equations that we'll use. We just pretend that alpha is just not there. For a minor technicality, it's important to note that the equations we derived are actually for a continuous case. Since we're dealing with discrete changes in stats, we actually should use an approximation of the equation. Now, here's the hard part. We now need to figure out what weapons and artifacts should be equipped. Again, assuming that we only really care about damage and nothing else, this simplifies things by quite a bit. Ningguang is a more traditional DPS and doesn't have complicated scalings, so this would be much more simple compared to some other characters. In order to make use of the equations we derived earlier, we actually need a starting point. What I mean is that we need some initial stats. This simply could be the character's base stats without any artifacts. I'll also just assume the weapon and artifact set. For the weapon, I'll use an unrefined Widsith with a 2-piece Archaic Petra and a 2-piece Gladiator's Finale. Because plumes always give attack flat in the main stat, I'll already put it into the initial stats. To determine which stat we should go for, what we have to do is compute the partial derivatives times their differential. These quantities tell how much they change our damage. Therefore, the quantity with the largest positive value would be the best stat to add or upgrade. I originally wanted to make a program to do it for me, but instead I decided to just do it in a spreadsheet. Hello everyone, it is me. I am doing this as a live commentary, as I want to be able to show you how to do the iteration process in more detail, and in general just go through the steps of how I did this with my spreadsheet. So yeah, let's start with the spreadsheet. What do we need to know? First off, we have this column, which is the iterations. It just shows which step we're on. Then this is our stats. We have base attack, which remains exactly the same because we're not changing our weapon. So yeah, anyway, enough about that. This is our attack percent, attack flat, geo damage bonus, crit rate, and crit damage. These are our initial stats. I already showed them earlier, so yeah. These are the partial derivatives of all the different variables. This one's the partial derivative of damage with respect to attack percent, partial derivative of damage with respect to attack flat, with respect to geo damage bonus, with respect to crit rate, with respect to crit damage. As we go through the iteration process, we will be updating these values. Next these are the differentials. These are the values we will put in to tell how much we're going to increase or decrease each stat. In this case, we're going to only consider increases. And lastly, these are the partial derivatives multiplied with their respective differential. So this is the partial derivative of damage. I also prepared a page here to show which stats are included on our artifacts. So here we'll see that this is this one, it will indicate the number of upgrades for each respective stat, and well, it will also indicate our main stat. And then here we'll just put in the values for the main stat, whichever ones get selected. So yeah, that's really all this is. It just calculates our stats. From here, we can now start the iteration process. So what I'm first going to do is to figure out what our main stats should be. I'll start off with our sands. So we're going to say our sands main, and we want to apply a main stat. So what main stat can we apply to a sands? Well, there's a bunch of them, but the only one that's useful is attack percent. So we're going to consider the maximum main stat value for attack percent, because again, we're trying to find the most optimal artifact iteration under specific assumptions. So the maximum value for a main stat in attack percent is 46.6%. We'll then apply that to our sands. So I'll now go to our stats spreadsheet and indicate here, this is attack percent. And I'm going to go here into this part and put in the value. It's up to you how you want to keep track of all your stats and whatnot. This is just how I'm going to do it. Anyway, enough about that. So once we now apply the main stat, we now have to upgrade. We have to go to our next iteration. So we're going to go to this iteration where we will increase our stat for attack percent specifically by 46.6%. And now we have 64.6% for our attack percent. But our attack flat remains the same, our damage, geo damage bonus remains the same, crit rate remains the same, crit damage remains the same, and so on. Let's now get into the goblet. We want to figure out what main stat we want to apply to our goblet. So we can either do attack percent or geo damage bonus. Which one should we choose? Well, yeah, we calculate our partial derivatives. These two are multiplied, and that gives us this number here. So as you can see here, it's those two numbers multiplied with each other. And this one, it's our geo damage bonus. We can see here that geo damage bonus will give a much larger increase in our damage. So therefore, we want to apply geo damage bonus on our main stat. Damage bonus on our main stat. So let's indicate that here. Geo damage bonus. And under our circlet, we want to indicate here that we have 46.6 on our goblet. We also need to update our stats. And our attack percent remains the same, attack flat remains the same. Our geo damage bonus will now increase by 46.6%. And then our crit rate remains the same, our crit damage remains the same. Now for our circlet. We have now applied all of our main stats. The thing is, what can we have on our substats? On our substats, we can, we know the thing that we need to watch out for is that our substat cannot be included if it is the main stat. So in this case, this one's HP flat. None of these substats are HP flat. So we can just apply those substats for our flower. For our plume, because we have attack flat, we cannot include attack flat in our substats. So I'm just going to put that as a 0. So this basically tells us the number of upgrades, quote-unquote upgrades. This 1 is just to tell that, hey, this substat exists. So yeah, anyway, enough about that. So I'll start with the flower substat, and we're going to apply. So these are going to be the maximum substat upgrades. So the maximum substat upgrade you can get for attack percent is 5.83%. The maximum attack flat you can upgrade you can get is 19.45. Crit rate, it's going to be 3.89%. Then for crit damage, it's 0.0777. So because all of these stats are going to be applied, all of them, we now have to add not just by one substat. We have to add that stat. We now have to add this stat. We have to add this one. Oh, wait, hold on. That's damage bonus. There's no upgrade for that one. So this one will be upgraded by this, and this one will be added by this much. Alright, so now we want to apply our substats on our our plume. We'll go by this one by one, and I'll just fast forward through this because I think you're starting to get the main idea. Alright, so now I've applied all of our substats. Now we're going to think about upgrades. Let's now think about this. So if we go to our flower, so we're going to do flower sub upgrade. Which substat are we going to upgrade? So we can upgrade either attack percent, attack flat, crit rate, or crit damage. We can see here that crit rate has a clear advantage in damage over the others. So let's upgrade our crit rate. So I'll indicate that in our stats here, in our stats under our flower, we're going to make this a 2. So this is what our stats look like now. All right. Now we're going to go over here and update our stats. Attack percent remains the same. Attack flat remains the same. Oh, hold on. Attack flat remains the same. Stop. What are you doing? Stop. Okay, there we go. Attack flat remains the same. Geo damage bonus remains the same. Crit rate will be upgraded. And our crit damage will be exactly the same. So now we're going to think about how we're going to do that 5 more times. So yeah, okay, it was pretty clear here that crit rate was not going, or no other stat other than crit rate was going to be upgraded. So yeah, and I think that makes sense because we have a lot of crit damage already from our Witsith. So I think that makes sense. So this will be a 6, and we should expect, oh wait, hold on a second, that's not right. So if we make a double check here, so we can see here that this is our 85.6% on our geo damage bonus. We have crit rate at 71%, and we have crit damage at that much. With that, we can now think about upgrading our plume substats. So plume sub, we're going to upgrade. We do this 5 times. So which substat are we going to upgrade? So keep in mind we don't have all of these substats. We don't have flat. I think it's also worth noting now, crit rate is getting pretty dangerously high. If this goes above 100% or it goes above 1, you should stop upgrading crit rate, because if it keeps upgrading crit rates, it doesn't affect anything anymore. So that's just something important to note. The equations don't know anything about that, so you might need to, like, if you're going to make a program for this, you need to hard code that in. Like, oh, if your crit rate is greater than or equal to 100%, don't upgrade crit rate substats anymore. So, yeah, anyway, enough about that. So, again, the clear winner here is crit rate, and now we can start to see what's going to happen next. What will happen next? Oh, we finally have a new contender. We have crit damage. Crit damage will now be upgraded. So, there we go. I should probably also indicate this in our stats. So our crit rate got upgraded once, and our crit damage got upgraded once. So there you go. So here's something interesting now. If we upgrade crit rate, look what happens to my stats. Whoops, not that. If I upgrade crit rate, we now have over 100% crit rate. So, let's put it here. Our crit rate will now be over 100%. Whether or not you want to include that, that is up to you. Now, personally, I think a 98% chance of critting is pretty good, so I think we don't need to be putting that much crit rate into that. We have to keep in mind that these partial derivatives don't really know anything about stuff like we fed it the average crit formula. It's kind of expected that it doesn't know that, 1, our crit rate has a maximum value, and 2, we also might want to consider a crit rate that's just relatively high enough to the point where you're critting consistently often, but not too much. I think you could start to see the problem here with using average crit here. It doesn't, if we try to use it for optimization, it kind of starts to fall apart if you have a goal for your crit rate. There is probably a maximum value or a best optimal crit rate value, but that would require a very specific probability. You have to figure out a probability distribution, and that's pretty different, or not necessarily, or just a distribution of damage over different substats, allocations, and whatnot. I think it's safe to say that we should not upgrade crit rate here. We should upgrade the next one, which is crit damage. So we're gonna go against the scenario here. And for our last upgrade, attack percent gets upgraded. So let's upgrade our attack percent, and we will end up with our final stats. Hold on, not damage bonus. Well, not that one. I'm gonna copy this row, and that's our finalized stats because we've basically maxed out all of our substats, all of our stats that we can upgrade. Now, the reason why I didn't calculate the total differential of damage is because it's not exactly the most useful. It only is more useful if you're trying to balance figuring out multiple, if you had, for example, if I had elemental mastery in this, if I had more different types of stats that I needed to consider, like elemental mastery, what other substats? HP percent, defense, whatever. If there were other substats that you needed to consider and potentially swap out for these substats, again, if I needed elemental mastery, when would I know that elemental mastery would be better to be applied over attack percent or attack flat or something like that? That's what the total differential damage is for, stats. If you're talking about upgrading stats, that's when you just only consider individual terms. Again, because Ningguang is a traditional attack scaling DPS, a lot of the substats are very predictable, and we don't need to use iteration to figure out which substats should be added to the artifacts. As you can see, the majority of the stats just went to crit rate and crit damage, but I suppose that's not too surprising. For a traditional attack scaling character like Ningguang, I think that these stats should make sense for the most part. Since we know that there technically is a maximum possible damage that you can achieve in the game, this does mean that you can see how close your stats are to being quote-unquote optimal. There's just one problem about what I've done in this video. I've made a ton of assumptions. Many of them are unrealistic and even impractical. Throughout this quest to find the quote-unquote optimal damage, apart from the weapon and artifact set assumptions, what I showed only considers a solo character whose stats never change, so no buffs, no nerfs, and hits only scale off of the same stats, dealing individual damage hits. Investment, teams, and time were all completely left out. This means that DPS, character buffs, enemy nerfs, and rotations are not actually considered. For instance, if you put everything into only attack, crit damage, crit rate, and damage bonus, most likely you're not going to have sufficient energy recharge to cast your burst as quickly as you'd like. I would like to point out that the method I showed could be expanded to include a more complicated character with more stats. The question becomes, how do you integrate the other factors into the optimization? Well, that requires knowledge in a lot of the game's mechanics, and you'd have to read up on a lot of theory crafting stuff. In general, for things other than damage, you essentially calculate the minimum of each stat that you desire. From there, we assign artifact stats until they meet those requirements. Once all those requirements have been met, you can utilize the method for finding the quote-unquote optimal damage shown in this video. In the case of considering burst cooldown and energy recharge, you ideally would want to maximize damage while being able to have your burst ready within a specific time frame. Note that this time frame doesn't have to be immediately when your cooldown has finished. I haven't looked enough into the energy mechanics to come up with anything. If ever, there is an amount of energy generated by each particle, and there's an associated average energy generated with each elemental skill. We also know our energy cost and how quickly we need our burst to be ready. From there, we should be able to calculate a required energy recharge for the character. By doing this, we actually are already assuming a team composition and rotation. I think it should be pretty clear that this gets complicated very quickly. It also requires some calculus background to properly implement. This is why the simplest optimization is to just look at the artifacts you currently have, and which ones contribute to a higher overall damage or something. In conclusion, to determine the quote-unquote best possible artifacts for a scenario with these assumptions, the following steps are to be performed. 1. Determine which stats contribute to the character's damage. 2. Simplify the damage equation. 3. Get the total differential for the damage equation. 4. Calculate the partial derivatives. 5. Determine the weapon and artifact sets to be used. And 6. Use iteration until all main stats and substats are filled. To respond to Neon, I would like to ask, was my answer satisfying? If I was to comment on anything, while this method can give an idea as to what sort of artifacts you should strive towards for your damage-dealing characters, Genshin Optimizer is much more time efficient than doing whatever I did in this video, and I hope you can see why. I do think that this method can be expanded to account for more scenarios, but it greatly increases the complexity of things and requires more theory crafting knowledge. I may end up coming back to this video topic and expanding it in the future, but I think this video is getting quite long. So yeah. In the end, artifact grinding is luck, and the best is whatever you get, so it really is just account specific. Thanks for watching, and hope you've enjoyed.